Today, we delve into the realm of shadows and whispers with Paranormal Stories. From a creature of nightmares to inexplicable occurrences in a hotel, these tales challenge the boundaries of reality. So, turn off the lights and let's explore these chilling accounts that might just make you question what's truly possible. Stay tuned and don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe for more spine-tingling adventures. Story 1. So my house is supposedly haunted. I'm very skeptical despite believing in ghosts, so whenever something happens, I first try to find a logical explanation for what happened as opposed to immediately thinking it was a ghost. Despite this though, there's one incident in particular which I can't for the life of me explain what it meant. This happened about a year ago. One random week, I started experiencing crazy vivid nightmares about this weird creature with burnt red skin, a top hat, and a trench coat staring into my room. It was screaming in a language I couldn't understand, might as well have been gibberish, and after a few minutes of being terrified, I realized it wasn't staring or yelling at me, but the massive teddy bear I keep in my bed. My fear immediately vanished once I realized this, and I woke up a little while later. The next nightmare I had occurred a few days after the fact. Given the horror of the last one, I'd been tense and paranoid the days following the first incident, yet given as I had vivid nightmares before, I brushed it off as just another incident of my hyperactive brain. From the second I saw it, I knew it was the same creature. Burnt red skin, gibberish language. Only difference this time was it had horns, and instead of yelling at something, it was openly mimicking the crucifixion of Christ. I'm not religious, so I'm not sure where that came from. Nightmares are weird. It was standing in the back of the upstairs hallway, and after another few minutes of terror, I woke up. I told my mom about these dreams shortly after because they were openly messing with my sleep schedule, insomnia, and in an attempt to fix the problem, she decided to use sage sticks and holy water to cleanse the house. I haven't had any vivid nightmares since she did that. I used to have them at least once a week, sometimes more, but since that particular cleansing, my dreams have been normal, and there's no sign of that particular creature either. Maybe it was coincidental. I'm willing to believe that if I try hard enough. I merely find it weird how all vivid nightmares ended after the house was cleansed. Maybe I'm just crazy. Story 2. I don't actually believe in ghosts, but this one always struck me. Once my mother, siblings, and I were staying in a hotel room overnight. Everyone was watching TV on the bed when I walked into the bathroom. Suddenly I hear them shouting my name. I call back, "What?" They kept calling, getting more frustrated. I walked out of the restroom and approached them. "What?" They looked totally surprised. "You were in the bathroom? Then what was that noise?" Behind the TV, a few feet away, was a window. They heard banging and clashing coming from the blinds, as though someone were attacking it. It went on for a suspiciously long time. They assumed it was me. We checked the area and found the blinds adjuster on the floor. Somehow, it fell off and made quite the commotion doing so. Later that night, I was sleeping on a pull-out bed next to that same window. For some reason, I was afraid, totally on edge, burning fear to the point of tears. It felt like if I turned my head, I'd see some demon or entity staring back from my bedside. Just this overwhelming sensation of being watched by something terrible. It got so bad I woke up my mom, who let me sleep with her. Much better after that. I'm still not convinced that ghosts are real, but life sure can be weird. Story 3. About 10 years ago, I was a front desk clerk for a hotel in a small vacation town. It was a 2-story building with about 60 rooms, so a decent-sized hotel. It was also our off-season, and the only night in my entire 2 years working there when we didn't have a single occupant. It was about 8 p.m., No one in the entire building but me, and no one expected to arrive. I was sitting on a stool behind the front desk fiddling with my phone when I heard the distinct sound of a laundry cart moving in our laundry room. These were big commercial-sized bins on small caster wheels. The laundry room had one entrance or exit, and I was sitting where I could see that door. To get to it, someone would have to walk right past me. At this point, I'm panicked that we're getting robbed or something. I grab some scissors and pre-dial 911. I can see the security cameras from the desk and no one is on them. I call out that I heard them and to please come out. No reply. I psych myself up and head back to investigate. There's no one. I searched everywhere there was to look and found nothing. I tested a bunch of theories on what could have happened. Nudging the cart like a mouse might do, throwing things in the cart like maybe some laundry fallen off the table, setting the cart up so it was on the rubber. Standing mat and pushing it off to see if maybe it had just finally worked its way down. The only way to replicate the noise I heard was a very strong shove. I'm a scientific person, a problem solver, someone who believes everything can be explained. I have a STEM degree, and I pride myself on my ability to figure out and understand how things work. The conclusion of this long and boring story is that I didn't really believe in the paranormal, but now I do without question, because it's the only explanation for what happened that night. I've had 2 other experiences since then. Each one solidifies my beliefs a little more. I saw a bottle simply topple over in a closed room, no one else there, no airflow, and I heard my name called out from a room that had no one in it. As far as I'm concerned, there's no other explanation for any of these beyond our dimension crossing over with another for the briefest moment. Story 4. When my grandma was on her deathbed, she had already just fallen asleep and was essentially in a coma. My mom and I were sitting in the bedroom with her, right by her bed, and we were the closest to the door. My great-grandfather, Grandma's dad, appeared. He passed away in 95 a year before I was born, so I had never met him. It was 2020 when Grandma died. I looked at my mom and said, "Grandma has Granddaddy Stack's smile." She thought about it, smiled, and agreed. She then asked how I knew that, and I said, "He's here, and he told me he's waiting on her." I saw him smile at her. Story 5. One night when I was 15 years old, I'm 24 now. I had a few friends over after baseball practice to hang out. I was always into the paranormal and spirits and things of that nature, but had never experienced anything personally. I was doing a trick where you can make steam come out of your mouth when I heard a little girl's voice as clear as day say, "Are you okay?" I was so surprised and yelled out in shock. There were no girls in that area of the house at that time. Many months later, I was sleeping in the same room that I heard the voice. I woke in the middle of the night and found that the covers were over my head, so I pulled them down. That's when I saw the figure of a little girl standing less than 2 feet away from me, just looking at me. Understandably, I covered my face, but when I finally looked again, she was gone. I have not heard or seen her since. Story 6. I was dead to the world asleep. This was before cell phones were a big thing. I heard a voice that sounded like my late grandmother say, "Pray for your daughter." Well, I am not religious, but I'm spiritual. My daughter was going to college in Florida, and some of her classmates were picking her up from the airport. It was late at night. She normally calls me when she gets back to the dorm. She hadn't called, and she wasn't there when I called her. So I prayed for her for about 3 hours. She finally called me back after the 3rd hour. She said they got lost near some swamp in Florida. They're POC, so you do the math. Florida, Boonies, POC, and young. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been praying. I just don't think it would have been good. Story 7. Not necessarily stereotypically paranormal, but I consider it as such. It was also hella creepy. TLDR, recently, finally, left my abusive soon-to-be ex-husband after 9 years of enduring his abuse. The carcass of a dead frog is what has recently helped me gain closure. During the first year of our marriage, my soon-to-be ex-husband pulled a disappearing act. Like, physically just disappeared shortly after we married. Didn't answer calls or text messages for months. During this period of 8 to 10 months, I attended a pottery painting class one evening. You know, where you pick an item off the shelf, paint it, and then stick it in a kiln for several days to harden. I had chosen a frog and painted it green because, you know, frogs are green. A few years ago, I bought a cute porch decoration. It was 2 frogs, arms laid across each other, doing the peace sign with their fingers, with a cell phone in their hands taking a selfie. It sat on the front porch of our former house. 2 weeks ago, when cleaning out the last 3 items in my storage unit, once those 3 items were on the wheeled cart, I saw a small dark object in the corner of my storage unit. It was no larger than a golf ball. I thought it must have been something of mine that dropped. So I walked over, picked it up, and just as quickly as I had picked it up, I shrieked and jumped from fright. It was the carcass of a long, dead frog, so rigid it felt as hard as a pine cone. As creepy as it was to be standing there, in my storage unit, all alone, at the very end of a dark hallway with flickering lights during evening hours. It was also a strangely empowering moment. Within the span of 30 seconds, my brain went from EW dead animal in my hand. I think this might be a sign about the end of my marriage. But it was also still creepy. Story 8. When I was a kid, I could travel outside of my body and did it frequently. My earliest memory of doing it was when I was in 1st grade. I was in the hammock in our backyard looking up through tree branches and felt floaty, and started saying to myself, "I'm not me," over and over, then found myself looking down at my body through the branches. I didn't really grasp what was happening, but neither did I really wonder about it. My consciousness was me floating, not with the body. I went into the house, saw Mom in the kitchen, went to my room, saw my brother in his room reading, went into my parents' room where we kids weren't allowed to go without permission, and saw a towel on their bathroom floor, which was a big no-no in our house. I don't recall how long I floated free, but I remember going back near my body and just enjoying the floatiness for a while. When I came back into my body, I recall no sensation of transfer. I just remember feeling heavy for a moment. I played this game a lot just to enjoy the floaty feeling and the sense of being unshackled. In fact, initially I had no idea what was happening. I'd never heard of this kind of thing before, and regardless, it didn't seem to me like a big deal. It was just a very positive, private feeling exercise. I wasn't doing it much by the time I reached my teens, and I recall trying to do it once when I was 16 or 17 and wasn't able. I have no idea why. I never hid the game intentionally, but I didn't talk about it with anyone as, again, it just didn't seem like a big thing. Besides, it felt private and very me. I never thought about whether others did it, either. In fact, the first person I ever told was my husband after we'd been married a few years. Story 9. I still have no explanation for this. It was 3 a.m. on a hot summer night in 2022. I couldn't sleep and I kept hearing very loud helicopter sounds for about an hour, which is weird, especially at 3 a.m. Something seemed to be in the sky. I live in a very quiet town. I opened the window and couldn't believe my eyes and ears. A giant storm wind was blowing, Gigantic purple and brown pile clouds were right over me, and lightning was flickering from behind them. It was terrifying because it was extremely loud. It was as if 10 helicopters were blowing nearby, but I couldn't see anything. I looked around in the sky expecting to see helicopters below the clouds. Nothing. I kept looking for minutes, trembling on my legs, and couldn't find the source of the noise. I went back to bed and kept listening, completely puzzled. If it was government drones or UFOs, why didn't anyone observe anything? I asked about it in our town group on Facebook and nothing. Story 10. I've had several in my youth. I don't know if they are actual paranormal events or if they are easily explainable with the proper knowledge. The very first one happened when I was just a child. I was sleeping at my grandmother's. I had just woken up and as usual I was looking around the room. My eyes caught something on the window. I saw a pale face and it was standing there, doing absolutely nothing. I was petrified. I kept looking at it for a while before I had built enough courage to turn around and pretend to be asleep. The pale face stayed there for several minutes. After it was gone, I waited some time before calling my grandma and I didn't leave the bed until she was in the room with me. My second event happened during my puberty. Interestingly, I was still at my grandmother's. I was enjoying my puberty one night. After some time, I saw a translucent figure at the edge of my bed. The figure pointed at the stairs, then disappeared. The very interesting part is that after a few seconds, I heard that my grandmother was coming downstairs. The way I saw it back then was that the figure was literally warning me that my grandma was soon going to arrive. I didn't hear my grandma coming downstairs because I was wearing headphones while I was watching adult content on my phone, so there's no way I could have imagined the figure. My last instance of a paranormal event happened while I was 18 years old. I was riding my bike through my small town, and while I was passing through a narrow street, I managed to see a white figure passing from one edge to the other edge of the road. To give you an idea of how this particular figure looked, imagine a Klansman wearing a torn-apart robe, and imagine him moving at a very high speed. Since it was broad daylight, I managed to get closer to the point without fear, and, needless to say, there was absolutely nothing when I arrived. Story 11. I've had a lot, but just now, while thinking of which one to post, I remembered one that I always forget about. I remember hearing another soldier talk briefly of his Iraq encounter while listening to a Bigfoot podcast. He talked about the weird lights at night while patrolling. 2003, it was a .50 cal rear MP gunner, and we were driving to our hutch at night. I had to get out my big-ass night scope that went on top of my .50 cal. It was working, but I was so confused as to what I saw through it and what my naked eye saw. Through my big-ass night vision .50 cal scope, I saw at least 4 campfires with people holding torches moving in a dance-like circle around those campfires. The campfires were spaced along the road for 2 or 3 miles with about 5 people holding touches slowly dancing or moving in a dance-like movement. The dance was more like if I was forced onto the dance floor. I would be planted, not moving, and slowly doing a nothing dance move to creep off the dance floor. I told my SGE about my scope not working right because I didn't want to be thrown into headquarters for being a female soldier because they all wanted me, the only female in the squad, out of their lives. I never saw the campfires, torches, or people with my own naked eyes. I buried it with all the other things. They never come up until something happens. I hope that the Bigfoot podcast person reads this and wishes that he at least wanted to hear me, the stupid female soldier that knows nothing. Story 12. I remember when I was a child, my mother, sister, and I were in the living room just minding our own going about our day. It was probably nighttime, and all three of us heard a lady's voice from out of nowhere. Nobody else was in the house but us. It creeped us out. One of them asked the other if she heard the same thing. I didn't ask anything about what happened, I don't think. I also remember a friend of my mother that she had a house that she claimed was haunted. My mother, sister, her friend Gabby, and I went to our mother's friend's house, and I remember getting out of the car, and Gabby, she got out of the car in a silly way and said, "All right, let's go," as she jogged her way to the front door. As we were there, everyone else was in the kitchen, and I was just standing in the living room. I looked over at the stairs, and I swear on my life, when I saw someone walk up the stairs with black socks that had 2 red stripes at the bottom, and it spooked me. I told my mother and everyone what I saw, and I hugged her because of how scared I was. Story 13. The following is the only experience that I've had. When I was a young teen, I randomly woke up and looked out of my bedroom door. There was a silhouette of a person standing just outside the doorway. I thought it was my brother and asked what he was doing there. The figure just stood there seemingly looking at me. I told him to cut it out and started to get up. The figure drifted out of sight sideways and silently into the hall. I quickly left my room and turned on the hall light. All of the bedroom doors were closed with the exception of mine. Our doors clicked loudly when shut, so no one could have closed their door without me either seeing it close or hearing it close. My heart was racing at that point. I checked on my parents and they were asleep. I think I checked on my other siblings, but can't remember that clearly. I turned on the bathroom light so it would partially shine into my room's doorway and tried to go back to sleep. As you'd expect, I didn't get much sleep that night. In the morning, when I was thinking back on what I had experienced, I remembered that the figure was tall, just below the height of a regular doorway. So it couldn't have been anyone that lived in my house. Story 14. My brother and I were on the way up to our family cottage up north. It's down a long, kinda creepy road off a main highway. Anyway, one time on the way up, nearish to where we pull off to the cottage road, we pass a van pulled over on the other side of the road for way flashers on, etc. But as we pass by, we see no one, either in or around the van. And as we get just a bit further past it, it spins around and drives towards us. We were going faster and went around a bend, which is where the turnoff for our road was, so we pulled down our long, windy road and continued along. About halfway to the cottage, the van is seemingly right behind us again, just a slight way behind us. We again take one of the forks in the road left towards our cottage and decide to stupidly stop off the side. We know all the people up here, so it's most likely one of our neighbors on the point. We pull off the side just after the fork and wait a moment. Then another moment. It's nearly pitch black except for our car's lights, so we decided to turn off the car to listen and look for lights. Didn't see anything, but we both heard some terrifying noises coming from the woods behind us when we were quiet. We both looked at each other and sped lights on the rest of the way and assumed it was a prank or joke so we could sleep through the evening. Then we seemingly forgot about it, but I remember. Story 15. The first time I remember waking up terrified and screaming, I was 4 years old. It was because I had a dream of a lady that looked off. Sorta broken, uncanny valley. I had this dream recurring for years. The lady's name was Alice. I'm a sorta chill guy that doesn't really get scared about much. But everyone in my family knew about Alice. It seemed like everyone was scared of her. Alice was bald with little John Lennon glasses, and the hospital cafeteria lights seemed to maintain a glare so her eyes were never visible. Her skin was ghostly and purple. When she looked at me, the world would consume me until I was paralyzed. She always looked only at me. Context: my real dad left before I was born, and I've never known him or his family at all. The dad I know is another man that raised me since I was an infant. His parents are my grandparents too. We never even talked about how we aren't blood. When I was 18, my brother asked me if I still see Alice. I told him yes. My mom interjected, "Wait, really?" with the sort of intense look that communicated that she was scared that I still saw her. I assured her I'm fine and it's under control. Seemed like she always coped with her worse than I did. I chalked it up to mother bear sorta empathy. About an hour later, the conversation had dissolved and my mom was in her room alone. She called me on my way by her door and she quietly told me that I really look a lot like her, but I really look more like my biological dad's family, and that my sense of humor was eerily like theirs even though my older brothers, same father, wasn't. The final thing that she told me about was that my real dad and my mom met through a mutual connection. My mom had a best friend named Angie. They grew up together and had a lifelong connection. Angie introduced my mom to her older brother, and then me and my older brother were born. Well, the year I was born, Angie passed away from the cancer she had been battling off and on for 5 years. Apparently, it was a big thing in the town. Fundraiser 5K, moment of silence at the football game type of thing. My mom told me that I always dreamed about a scary lady even when I was really young. She told me that she never experienced anything paranormal beyond strange feelings other than when I was young. She would walk by my room and notice me asleep and uncovered and turn right back to cover me up to find me completely tucked in. This happened multiple times. Every time she called her friend Shauna to spend the night. Come to think of it, I remember Shauna spending the night on the couch a lot and not knowing why. This led me on a journey to discover more about that half of my family. I found Angie's grave after weeks of trying to be a detective. There was a photo on her headstone of her. My aunt was the woman from my dreams. A week passed and I thought of Angie a lot. I wasn't dreaming about her anymore, but when I was awake it was like I could feel her somehow. Not standing anywhere specifically or somewhere inside of me, but somehow it seemed like she was there. I wasn't scared of this feeling. In that week, I actually remember wishing I could feel like I could get some privacy. Except one night out of nowhere, I had a panic attack and felt I was in near-death danger. My head felt floaty for a second, and then I couldn't feel her anymore. I haven't felt her a day since. She hasn't come to me in my dreams. It's been 8 years. Story 16. This isn't my personal experience, but my aunt's maternal. She's a school teacher in South India and was in charge of a high school excursion with 14 other teachers and 340 students. The trip spanned 4 to 5 days, and on the last day, they had to move to a new hotel. It was after dinner, around 11:55 p.m., and my aunt, along with another teacher, her roommate, was conducting rounds in the hotel to ensure all students were in their rooms and ready for bed. She resided on the second floor, while the students, 3 per room, were spread across all floors up to the 6th floor. The first thing that was sort of weird was that the elevator would just not cooperate with what floor they wanted to go to. She described it as if the elevator had a mind of its own, making unintentional stops on various floors. After completing routine checks, my aunt returned to her room on the 2nd floor to prepare for bed. Later, a student from the 6th floor called her to tell her someone keeps knocking on their door, ding-dong ditching, if you will. She dismissed it as a student prank, advising them to ignore it and go to bed. The student tells her that they tried to ignore, but it was so disturbing because it was happening almost thrice within a minute. They even stood by the door multiple times to open it as soon as they heard the knock, but when they opened the door, there was no one outside. My aunt still tells them to just ignore it and go to bed, but she feels a little uneasy after hanging up and decides to go check herself. She tried to wake her roommate up, but she was out cold after a long day of activities. She took the elevator and, of course, made unintentional stops at a few other floors before reaching the 6th floor, and then went to the student's room, who called and checked that everything is okay. They tell her they still kept hearing someone knocking, but they'd just been ignoring it. She decides to head back and steps into the empty elevator. The elevator is cube-shaped, and she presses the button for the 2nd floor and stands at the front left corner of the elevator. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she notices someone standing in the back right corner. She freezes on the spot and does not turn completely to look at the person. From the glimpse she caught from her peripheral, she says that it was as though the person was adjusting their clothing in a specific way, leading her to believe it was a woman adjusting her sari. At one point, within the span of a 10-second elevator ride, she even thought that maybe her mind was playing tricks on her and turned ever so slightly to see out of her peripheral vision if the person was still there, and to her utter dismay, they were. She only remembers closing her eyes and praying to God that her floor would come faster. She says she couldn't process any thoughts or proper emotions in that elevator other than her prayer and the fear that at any moment she might feel a tap on her shoulder. Once on the 2nd floor, she sprinted almost 20 meters, this was a big hotel, to her room, locking the door without looking back. Her roommate is still sleeping with no care in the world. My aunt decided to just lie down and go to sleep saying her prayers. Not 5 minutes later, her phone rings again, and it's another teacher telling her to rush to the 7th floor as another teacher is having a seizure. This teacher has a history of seizures. She somehow wakes her roommate up and they both rush to the elevator to go to the 7th floor. At this point, my aunt says that with all the commotion and panic regarding the ill teacher, she's completely forgotten about what transpired just minutes ago in that exact elevator. They reach the 7th floor, and my aunt tells her roommate to go down to the lobby to get in contact with the doctor. All the teachers have now gathered in the ill teacher's room trying to help. Her seizure has started to calm down at this point. My aunt called her roommate to get an update on the medical help. The roommate says the neighboring building is a hospital and the hotel has alerted them of the emergency, and they're on their way with a stretcher or wheelchair to take her to the hospital. My aunt then told her to come back up to the 7th floor while they waited for the help to arrive. To my aunt's surprise, she tells her she'll just stay down in the lobby and that she's not coming back up. My aunt, having still forgotten what had happened to her in the elevator, is a bit put off by her response and thinks that she's being a bit insensitive. Help arrives and the ill teacher is taken to the hospital. My aunt and her roommate stayed back at the hotel to get dressed more appropriately to go to the hospital. As they were getting dressed, the roommate told my teacher that the reason she wouldn't come back up was because she didn't want to take the elevator. My aunt started to recall what happened earlier and asked her to elaborate. She hadn't yet told her what she saw in the elevator as she wanted to see if their stories would match. The roommate tells her she felt a presence right behind her, although there was no one in the elevator when she entered. She didn't dare to turn around to check, but it felt as though they were getting closer and closer to her. She managed to reach the ground floor and ran outside, having not turned around once. My aunt also tells her what she experienced earlier. They both get to the hospital to see how the ill teacher is doing. They both decided to share what they experienced with the other teachers. And that's when every single teacher started saying they also felt very off about the elevator and the hotel in general. One teacher even said that as she was trying to sleep, she kept feeling like a third person was lying in bed with herself and her roommate. She didn't dare to check around and just shut her eyes and went into the covers. Another teacher mentioned how there was one student who, within 10 minutes of entering her room, started crying and did not stop until she left the room and was assured she could sleep in a teacher's room for the night. When the teachers asked her two roommates, they told her that she kept saying she could see someone sitting in the corner of the room. They all packed up the next morning and were just grateful that the trip was over and that they could head back home. Story 17. When I used to be young, around 4 years old, I lived in a 2-story house in Maine. The day it happened, it was only my mom and I, and we were in the living room. All the bedrooms were upstairs, and I had the original Xbox with Crash Bandicoot Racing, so I told her I was going to play that game. As I started to walk up the stairs, I looked at the top of the stairs, and there was the dark figure of a man. It spooked me so bad that the best way to describe what I did next was run down the few stairs I walked up, and a dolphin dived onto the couch like it was Call of Duty. I proceeded to tell my mom someone was in the house and was so scared when she went upstairs, but she said no one was there. Fast forward a couple of years when I was 6 and my brother was 3, in a bedroom next to the top of the same stairs, my dad was tying our shoes on the bed. In the middle of this, I just for some reason looked at the doorway and saw a man walk past the door down the hallway. I didn't say anything at first because I thought there might have been a guest home, but when I asked my dad about the guest, he said that no one else was home. Years later, when I brought up these stories, my dad had told me that my grandfather had passed away in the bathroom on the 2nd floor of that house. I'm not sure if I saw my grandfather those 2 times, but it does make me wonder. Besides one other unrelated and brief paranormal experience, I've never seen or heard anything else to this day 15 years later. Story 18. My grandmother died in October 1995. 7 months later, my grandfather was in hospice, so we were all staying with him in his final days. One morning, we were awakened by him yelling, "No, it's not fair. It's finally my time." We all felt that he was yelling at my grandmother because she came to take him. We believe that "it's finally my time" part was because he was mostly tolerated because he was a terrible father, beating his kids and wife, alcoholism. But to me, he was a wonderful grandfather. But once my grandmother was gone, all the attention was on him, and I guess he didn't want to lose it. He lasted another week or so. My aforementioned grandmother died a few months before my 16th birthday. I came home from school and checked the answering machine. There was a raspy voice singing "Happy Birthday, Dear Paul." I assumed it was my aunt, so I called to thank her, and she said she didn't call. The only other person that sounded like her was my grandmother, both smokers. I knew it had to be someone in the family because they all call me Paul while everyone else calls me Mike. I went to listen to the message again, and there was nothing there. Last one. My stepdad had gone into a nursing home and wasn't doing great. My mom was going to a party with her cousin, and I was grumpy that I was going to have to stay up and drive her drunk ass home at midnight. I told my wife and daughter it was okay because she needed it because her husband is going to die in like 8 hours. I drove her home and went to bed. At 3 a.m. I sat up in bed, said, "Goodbye, Joe," and went right back to sleep. A few hours later, my mom called to say he passed overnight. Story 19. As a kid, I would go back and forth between my mom and dad's house. My dad's house sits not far behind an old plantation in North Carolina. The plantation house itself is preserved and available for tours and whatnot. But most of the land behind it has houses built over the old grounds. I had a lot of paranormal experiences at that house, but there are 3 that stick out to me. One night, when I was probably 7 or 8, I was staying the week with my dad. He had picked me up late that night, and when we got to the house, I was basically falling asleep standing up. My suitcase was super heavy since I was staying for a longer period of time, and I had to have my dad carry it up the stairs for me. The next morning, when I woke up for school, my suitcase was in bed with me, beside my head. I asked my dad and stepmom if they had done it, and they both said no. I know I don't sleepwalk, and that suitcase was too heavy for me to pick up like that anyway. The second event I remember vividly was when I was in 6th grade. I was going to the movies with some friends and spending the night with them, so I was upstairs packing a bag and getting ready. Out of nowhere, I felt a wave of cold fear come over me for no apparent reason, but I was almost done getting ready, so I ignored it. I was just about to walk out of the bathroom when my light bulb fully exploded and glass went all over the room. I started sprinting down the stairs, and about halfway down, I felt a shove on my shoulder, and I fell down the stairs, spraining my wrist. Lastly, my stepmom and I used to see figures sometimes around the house. She's seen it more than I have, but I saw it clear as day a few times. It was about 5 a.m. I was 17 at the time, and my dogs started barking downstairs, which isn't unusual for them as they like to sit on the back of the couch and look out the front windows. I ignored it for a minute, but I noticed this wasn't their normal barking at animals. It sounded aggressive, and they were at the back door, so I went downstairs to check. For context, we had French doors with blinds that roll up and down that lead to the back porch. So, when the outside light is on, if a cat or a raccoon is on the back porch, you can see its silhouette. I went downstairs and went to turn on the living room light, and right before I flipped the switch, I looked over and saw a tall, black figure standing in front of the door. It wasn't a tree or an animal standing outside. This was a full human shape standing there facing me. I turned on the light, it disappeared, and my dogs stopped barking immediately and went back to the couch. I could go on for days about the things that happened at that house, but those are the first stories to come to mind. Story 20. Not my own mostly, but my family has a bit of a history for it. My grandma is very spiritual, or at least she believes in a lot of spiritual things. My dad talks about her getting palm readings and things when she was younger. Anyway, she swears by the story that there was a particular time in her life she met some random people who offered to play a Ouija game with her. She agreed. They did this seriously, and she asked some questions of her own. The board told her things no one else could know, such as where her great-grandfather died, that she was going to have 3 boys and a granddaughter named Lily. The Ouija claimed to be her great-great-great-grandmother. I might be missing a great one, and her name. My gran went home and researched her genetics extensively and confirmed this person had been in her family tree and was a traveling person. After this, strange things occurred where she'd think or wish something and it would happen. The most overwhelming and the turning point that freaked her out was when she thought, not kindly, but just in a spiteful mood, that she hoped her neighbor fell as he was on his ladder. Immediately he did. After, paranoid or illogical, she went to stay once with her then husband. Through a separate conversation, as they don't communicate anymore, he reflected on having seen her in an utter trance and had no recollection of the actual seance, but apparently the strange happening stopped. She also recounts how her friend's husband died and a short while after she had numerous dreams of him, having never actually met him. She told this friend about one such dream of the man and the friend dancing, down to specific clothing, and the friend cried and told her that it was the first night they'd danced. Similarly, my gran described a certain strange scent when she got in her friend's car months later, which her friend confirmed was his aftershave. In her dreams, she came to be aware of a number of significant moments in their marriage she couldn't have done and believed entirely it was the husband letting his wife know he was okay. Less exciting, but she was a midwife, and they all shared a belief in the ward that you can tell when a baby comes out and has lived life before. She says it is in their eyes, and that my father was one such child. She believes in reincarnation, as you can tell, and my father has memories of them holidaying in certain homes, and her being aware that a spirit died there when they set foot in it, and him being able to go back and confirm it. She told me she would go to houses and know if a baby had been born in that room. She believes it to be a really important gift, and when I got into tarot reading a few years back and told her the unexplainable scenario where I had an image in my head that directed me to assume a client was of Chinese heritage, no profile photo or anything for me to decide that, and got it right, encouraged me, and even picked up the cards herself, though I haven't tried to practice in a while. That leads on to my father, who didn't directly have much experience himself, though he got a palm reading young once from a reader and was refused and refunded as she insisted she could not read him, oddly. Not for a lack of time or anything, just apparently she couldn't. For him, the big thing was when he was dating my mother in uni and had her stay over at his. They were sleeping in the same bed when she started talking, upright, to someone in her sleep. He looked round to see what he believed to be a woman standing. He shook my mother awake and she screamed. My nanny ran in, but the woman was gone. My mother recalled it as her own great-grandma. In another instance, he was with my mother in a pub when she had a flash of it in the olden times and insisted they leave. She doesn't let us talk about the paranormal, which is why I got this all from my dad's perspective. It freaks her out to remember any of it. The only personal accounts I have are pretty boring. Lots of deja vu, like most people thought I'd like to know how that works. Sometimes it's really impossible for it to be something I think I know about. Of my brother having similar intense conversations in his sleep. He once insisted a man was in his room, and when I raced in, he calmly was informing me there was a man, then went back to sleep with no explanation and freaked me out. Don't know if that's at all related or just him being him. I used to get weird, vivid pictures in my head I couldn't recognize when I was most into spirituality, and when my cat died, I often felt at random times brushing against me in the same way she had done. I had a dream about a boy losing all his teeth when I was younger in my classes, and the next day he lost one. The day went exactly as I dreamt it, minus every tooth being lost, of course, much to my horror, LOL. Unlike my usual nightmare or dreams, this felt very realistic and memorable. Probably a coincidence that my stories are a bit less exciting than theirs. Story 21. I have always had something follow me, ever since I was around 8. It used to call my name as my mum late at night. Being young, I thought it actually was her, so I would answer. Annoyed, because she would never respond, only calling my name in the same voice. When I was older, my cousin and best friend were having a sleepover. We were playing a game called Trouble at like 2:45 a.m. when we heard scratches down the hallway that lead to my room, and then 3 knocks on my door. I opened it fast and said BOO. Thinking it was my mum. Silence. I could literally hear her snoring in her room. And then it happened again, only this time my door flung open. With such force it broke my mirror directly behind my door. I had one of those doors that you had to push in a little, otherwise the draft would open my door every once in a while, but nothing with that sort of force. And I always shut it properly. After that, us 3 young girls were crying and screaming for my mum. She didn't wake up. I heard all of the taps in the house turn on. It eventually flooded my entire house. Only then did she wake up and scream at us for playing tricks. That'll stay with me for life. Story 22. I had 2 when I was in my 20s. They don't involve ghosts, demons, or cryptids, but they have the advantage of being true. I used to work in a factory that made wiring harnesses for cars. There were a few people that I talked to, but most of them I didn't. One day as I walked past one of the ones that I didn't talk to, I had a sudden picture in my mind, and I turned to them and said, "You had a pet deer when you were a kid." Their eyes opened wide and they responded, "How did you know that?" The second experience involved a female friend I used to hang out with. I was in my apartment trying to astrally project something which I had never tried before when, for a second, I found myself in her upstairs hallway before being suddenly back in my apartment. I would have passed it off as a delusion except the next day when I went to visit her. She said, "The weirdest thing happened last night. I brought a guy home after a date, and he was in the upstairs hallway when he suddenly screamed. When I asked him what was wrong, he said a guy just appeared and disappeared in front of him, and he described you." I had not told her about my attempt at this point.